Results are in from a majority of precincts, and they show our campaign in first place.
I'm Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press, and this is Ground Game. Democrats are on to New Hampshire and hoping to put the Iowa caucus debacle behind them. New Hampshire has long had an independent streak and a reputation for jump-starting candidate comebacks. But after Iowa, there are a lot of Democrats who are just hoping the state can count the vote. The Iowa caucuses were marred by an embarrassing technical glitch that caused delays in reporting the results. Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, is narrowly leading Bernie Sanders, the progressive favorite. Elizabeth Warren trails behind, and former Vice President Joe Biden is expected to finish a disappointing fourth. It sets up a fascinating clash of candidates in the next contest, the New Hampshire primary. Hunter Woodall is AP's national political reporter in New Hampshire. He spent the past year in the state and joins me now on Ground Game. Hunter, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Hunter, this is basically your Super Bowl. You have been in New Hampshire for the year. We now have all of these candidates who are desperate to get a victory out of this state. What is the vibe in New Hampshire coming out of what was really just a stunning series of developments in Iowa?
Well, when you look at this, when you look at last month, the top tier, they spent the most time here. They still were out campaigned by other folks like Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang, but the Buttigieg folks have invested a lot of time here. And if you're Buttigieg, you're probably feeling pretty good about your standing in the state. In New Hampshire, independents can vote in the primary. So that's a whole voting block. That sometimes votes in the Republican primary, sometimes votes in the Democratic primary that can get into this. Senator Sanders has the largest announced staff in the state. Senator Warren was out here early. She invested a lot of time early on in 2019 and a lot of staff that is well regarded. With Biden, though, it's interesting because even though he didn't have to juggle with impeachment like the senators did, he did not spend that much time in New Hampshire last month. He actually only had 2 public events in the state. And it was with Biden. He's really asking voters, give me a look, give me a chance. He seemed to be trying to evoke that Bill Clinton 1992 comeback kid mantra, give me a chance, New Hampshire, help me get back on track.
I want to get back to your time with Biden in a minute, but you talked about New Hampshire, and it is an independent-minded state because, in part, independent voters can participate in these primaries. You've spent time talking to probably hundreds of voters in the state over the last year. What are your insights into these voters? What is on their mind heading into the primary next week?
I think in most elections, there'd be issues that really, motivated them or really driving them out. And obviously, healthcare is one that voters turn to a lot. The overriding theme for so many of the voters I've talked to is they really just want to beat President Donald Trump. I talked to one voter at a Michael Bennet event in late January, and she was saying she had somebody she wanted to vote for, but she doesn't think that person can beat Trump. So she was still undecided at that time. And that seems to be what's really tying folks in knots right now. And again, I can't tell you how many voters I talk to who say, at this point, I'm usually volunteering with a candidate. I'm usually out there, but right now I'm on the sideline because I cannot make up my mind.
So still, at this point, you're hearing from New Hampshire voters who say they just don't know what they're going to do in the primary?
Exactly. And they weren't looking to Iowa to show them how they were supposed to feel. New Hampshire doesn't tend to follow Iowa in most cases. The last time was in 2004 when John Kerry won both Iowa and New Hampshire. But it does seem to be that New Hampshire enjoys that contrarian streak of, okay, Iowa did this, we're going to do something a little different.
And really, this time, for a while at least, Iowa didn't really seem to produce much guidance at all for anybody. We now have results at this point. Hunter, one of the things I think is interesting about New Hampshire is for a long time, this looked like it would be a contest between 2 neighboring state candidates. Bernie Sanders is from Vermont. Elizabeth Warren is from Massachusetts. Did you get any sense from other campaigns that they were writing New Hampshire off, that they were looking beyond the Granite State because of that dynamic?
It was a mix because when you look at some campaigns, like Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar, she has spent a lot of time in New Hampshire. Now, she has a smaller staff than some of the candidates in that top tier, but she spent a lot of time in the state. And you've seen that because there hasn't been so much of a focus from some of these folks in the top tier, some of the lesser known candidates, more dark horse candidates, Andrew Yang, Tulsi Gabbard, Michael Bennet, Deval Patrick are really emphasizing New Hampshire. Now, whether or not that's going to pay off a result is very hard to say. But Biden he didn't spend as much time in the state since he announced, he would do trips up here. But there did seem to be this thought of, okay, Warren got here early. Sanders is well known. Is that going to be a problem? But then when you look at Buttigieg, he really has spent time in New Hampshire. Obviously, yard signs don't vote, but you drive around New Hampshire, you see lots of Pete signs. He's popular. People seem to be receptive to what he's doing. And you rarely hear the concerns of, oh, he's 38. Is this a good path to go down?
That's interesting. You don't hear a lot of concerns about him being a small town mayor. One candidate who is trying to make that case newly is Joe Biden. Hunter, you were with Biden as he really started to pick up the aggressiveness of his attacks on Buttigieg and on Sanders. What was the dynamic like with the vice president earlier today?
So the day before, Biden had sort of not quite tried to laugh off the Iowa results, but was more playful about them. But he did start criticizing Bernie Sanders directly over Medicare for All and really touting the healthcare plan that Biden wants, which is, a public option that he says builds on the Affordable Care Act. Today, he continued to criticize Senator Sanders, but this time it was, okay, here's what happens if somebody self-described as a Democratic socialist is the nominee, how's it drag down the rest of the ticket? And then, so in a bit of a surprise, he then turned to Buttigieg and said, look, I like him, I respect him, but he is a risk. He is a risk if he is the nominee because, what happens when we have a mayor of a city of, roughly 100,000 at the top of the ticket? What impact does that have? And that's a question that you haven't heard somebody who was vice president for 2 terms criticizing the former mayor of South Bend. It's a fascinating dynamic in the race.
How do you think this is going to go over with voters in New Hampshire? Because I know you've heard this from a lot of voters, and I've heard it too. They have been uncomfortable with the idea of Democrats taking on each other because they don't want to damage their eventual nominee in a contest against Trump. How do you think voters will take this sharper, more aggressive stance from Biden?
Talking to a few voters in the room after it happened, people seemed okay with it. I will say I was talking to one voter, a Biden supporter, who had warmed more to the idea of Biden criticizing Sanders and Buttigieg. Because I do think, for voters who might not have come around to Buttigieg yet, there's this thought of he's a future candidate too. So really, having a former party standard bearer criticizing Buttigieg might not sit well with them. Again, it's hard to say how it gets handled because I do think people want clarity at this point. The Democratic voters I talk to don't really want to see infighting and all that. But again, I think they just want a clear answer on who's going to be the one to beat Trump. I wonder if whatever gets them there is what they're going to start focusing on in these next few weeks.
Hunter, stay right where you are. When we come back, I want to ask you about the Republicans running in New Hampshire. We're back on Ground Game. I'm joined by Hunter Woodall. He's AP's national political reporter based in New Hampshire. Hunter, we've been talking about the Democrats. You've had an interesting side assignment over the last several months, which is to keep an eye on some of the Republicans who have been campaigning in New Hampshire, trying to launch a challenge to President Donald Trump. Any sign of any success in that area?
When you look at New Hampshire, there are those self-described never Trump folks. And in a state with independents that can vote in the primary, if there is going to be a serious challenge to President Trump, it happens in New Hampshire because those independent-minded voters who I've met, they voted for John Kasich in the 2016 GOP primary. And, now they're shopping around the Democrats. If you're Joe Walsh, the former, Illinois congressman running against Trump in the primary, or former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld, those are the voters you need to have any mark, any dent in this primary. And from what I've seen, that's just not happening. New Hampshire voters really want their vote to matter, which is, again, why you see these independents who voted for Kasich in 2016 as a vote sort of to hurt President Trump in the primary here. They don't want to just cast a vote knowing that it could be, 10% less than that these candidates get, because Trump is very popular with New Hampshire Republicans, especially the New Hampshire Republican Party. A national committeeman from New Hampshire recently lost his reelection race. He was a big proponent, big friend of John McCain. He lost to a challenger much friendlier to President Trump. So there is this kind of remaking of the GOP in New Hampshire. And the challengers to Trump in the primary don't seem to be getting traction.
It's so interesting to me because, as you say, if there was going to be a challenge to Trump, it probably would have launched in New Hampshire. And yet we have seen the Republican Party in that state really move in the president's direction. Trump himself will be out there right before the New Hampshire primary trying to steal a little bit of attention away from the Democrats, who have an extremely competitive contest on Tuesday. Hunter, in these final days before the primary, what are you going to be watching for on the Democratic side? Are there certain areas that you think we should be paying attention to? What dynamics on the ground will you be looking for?
Like I said early on, Senator Warren seemed to be stealing Senator Sanders' thunder in New Hampshire. She was out here earlier. She had a larger staff earlier. She out-campaigned him, I believe, through the end of August of last year. And I would talk to voters who were Sanders voters in 2016 in the primary. Again, he won by 22 points in the New Hampshire primary over Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Those voters then seem to be going to Warren at that point. But a lot of them seem to have gone back to Senator Sanders in these last few months. It really seems since his heart attack, he has regained that momentum. So that block of voters, those Senator Sanders 2016 voters who are either undecided or moving back and forth, I'm keeping an eye on them. I'm also watching Senator Amy Klobuchar because she has locked down a decent swath of the moderate wing of the New Hampshire Democrats. And for Biden, as he tries to make this comeback, Klobuchar could really end up hampering his chances at gaining momentum. She's been out here more than he has. She's made friends, and she has some of those good endorsements that Biden probably wishes he had.
Klobuchar currently in fifth place in Iowa, but really nipping at the heels of Vice President Biden. And as you say, Hunter, stealing likely some moderate votes away from Biden. Hunter Woodall, you have a busy couple of days ahead of you before we get to the New Hampshire primary. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us on Ground Game.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of Ground Game. Now that the 2020 primary has begun, we'll be here every step of the way, giving you all the news you need to know, twice a week. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. This episode of Ground Game was recorded at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, February 5th. Some of the details of our discussion may have changed by the time you hear this. For up-to-date developments on all of your news, head over to apnews.com. From the Westwood One Podcast Network.